Did you know that your reading of a text equals the lens through which you view it?
Everything you need to easily pass English ATAR. English ATAR made simple. Powered by Saints Coaching.
Your reading, interpretation, and response. I'm going to flag why we're looking at all these concepts in the one lesson now, because I think it will help you get a sense of the bigger picture. The reason we're looking at reading, interpretation, and response together is, firstly, your reading determines your interpretation. Secondly, your interpretation then determines your response. In short, the interplay is that our reading leads to our interpretation and our interpretation leads to our response. We'll return to this towards the end of the lesson, but just bear that interplay in mind as we get there. We'll also address why this word your is in the title of this lesson. Here are all the times the three concepts have appeared in a past WACE exam question between 2016 and 2022. Interpretation and response in 2016, response, interpretation and response again in 2017, then in 2018, interpretation, then in 2019, response, interpretation, in 2020, interpretation, meaning, and interpretation. Spoiler alert for later on, this word meaning is interchangeable with interpretation. That's why I have highlighted it and emboldened it in this question. Finally, in 2021, we have meaning and response again. Interestingly, we didn't have either of these three concepts appear in the 2022 WACE exam. If anything, I think that's more of a reason for at least one of these three concepts to appear in yours. Relevant syllabus points, of which we have 7. We've got meaning here, responses, meaning and meaning. Once again, remember that meaning and interpretation interchangeable in this situation, in this context. Then the other 3, interpretations, response, responses, and readings. Lesson objectives. Firstly, we will understand reading. We'll do that by defining reading. Then we'll discuss what influences your reading of a text. Then we'll move on to explaining that your reading of a text equals the lens through which you view it. Who would have thought? Then we will explain reading practices. From there, we'll understand interpretation by defining interpretation. Then we'll discuss the interplay between your reading and your interpretation of a text. Then we will understand response. We'll do that by defining it. Then we'll outline words to describe your response to a text. After that, we will explain the interplay between your reading of, interpretation of, and response to a text, which is what I flagged at the beginning of this lesson a few minutes ago. Then we will highlight the significance of the words you and your in analytical exam questions that come from the comprehending and responding sections. And we'll do that by describing an analogy. After that, we will analyze a past WACE exam question and, drum roll, outline a simple summary. Starting with reading. Firstly, what's our definition? This is what Scarza has to say about it. As always, nice and lengthy. The process of making meaning of text. This process draws on a repertoire of social, cultural, and cognitive resources. Reading occurs in different ways for different purposes in a variety of public and domestic settings. Reading is therefore a cultural, economic, ideological, political, and psychological act. The term applies to the act of reading print texts or the act of viewing a film or static image. The main part of this definition is the first sentence, the process of making meaning of text. The English ATAR made simple definition is basically what we see in this first sentence with one slight little tweak, and that is just the inclusion of the word a, the letter A, between of and text. So our definition is process of making meaning of a text. The main word from this definition is the word process. Whenever you see this concept of reading in English ATAR, I want you to immediately associate it with this word process. I cannot stress that enough. Reading refers to the process of making meaning of a text, not the meaning itself. We'll come back to this later on. Another really important thing to understand about this concept is its application. When does it apply in English ATAR? The last sentence of that glossary definition that we just read out tells us. The term applies to the act of reading print text or the act of viewing a film or static image. So, reading applies to the physical act of reading a print text, like a book, or the act of viewing a film, or the act of viewing a static image. To simplify that even further, this concept applies to any text that you study in English ATAR. Why is that? Quite simply because you go through a process of making meaning of any text that you study in English ATAR, regardless of whether it is a book, a movie, or an image. I'm emphasizing that because it's natural to see this word reading and think that it just applies to reading a book. So, to be clear, this term reading does not only apply to the act of reading a book. This concept of reading in English ATAR has a more expansive definition than the word reading as we understand it in everyday life. In English ATAR, reading refers to the process of making meaning of any text. One process of making meaning of a text could be the act of reading a book, but it's not the only process. As we progress through this lesson, this will make more sense. We know what the word reading means. The next question is, what influences our reading of a text? There are 9 different concepts, and the first one, which is the main one, is context. Next, we have perspectives, values and attitudes, genre expectations, language features, stylistic choices and features, structural features, themes, ideas, issues, and concepts, and finally, inclusions, omissions, emphases, and marginalizations in the text. We'll discuss the main factor first, which is context. You'll recall from the lesson on context that we have 2 different categories of context, and within each category, 2 different types. One category is the context of production and the context of reception. Another category refers to the context of culture and the context of situation. The context of production refers to the environment in which the text was produced, and within that type of context, we have the cultural context, and embedded within the cultural context, we have the situational context. Then the context of situation refers to the environment in which the text was received. Like production, we have the cultural context, and then we have the situational context embedded within it. So here we're talking about how all of those different types of context can influence the process of making meaning of a text, starting with the context of production and specifically the context of culture. The question to ask is, what general features influenced the production of the text? Remember that general features refers to that acronym GRIPS-H or GRIPSH, which stands for geographical, religious, ideological, political, socio-cultural, and historical features. Example, how did the United States history of racism and gun violence influence the production of Childish Gambino's This Is America music video? How does that interpretation influence the way you make meaning of the video? Turning to context of situation, question to ask, what specific features influence the production of the text? Remember, our acronym for specific features is PIT. P is for personal context, I is for immediate events, and T is for time, place, and medium. Example, how did the situational context of the movie The Interview, which involved North Korea threatening action against the US, impact the way I made meaning of that text? That was a discussion of context of production and the cultural context and situational context within it. Now let's have a similar discussion in relation to context of reception, which, as we know, refers to the environment in which the text is received. Starting with context of culture, question to ask, what general features influence the reception of the text? Example, how would watching the 2011 movie Contagion in 2020 when the pandemic started impact the way you make meaning of that movie? Context of situation, what specific features influence your reception of the text? Example, how does your situational context influence the way you make meaning of Olivia Rodrigo's song, Good For You? So that is a discussion of the main factor, context, and how that influences our reading of a text. Let's have a quick discussion of those other 8 concepts. Question to ask, what perspectives does the audience hold that are relevant to the text? Let's say my perspective is that employees should not be expected to engage in work-related electronic communications in their private life. How would that perspective then influence the way I make meaning of the 2020 Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma? Next up, values and attitudes. Question: what values and attitudes does the audience hold that are relevant to the text? Let's say Marcus values animal welfare and he has a critical attitude towards people who eat meat. How would that value and attitude influence Marcus's process of making meaning of the following article? Joe Rogan says he's back on the carnivore diet to start 2023. Next one, genre expectations. Questions to ask. Firstly, what might an audience expect to take place within the genre or genres the text falls within? Secondly, do those things actually take place in the text, and how might this affect the audience? Example, I expected Sebastian and Mia in La La Land to fall in love and live happily ever after because that is something that is expected. It's conventional in romance movies. The fact that didn't happen made me search for a deeper meaning, a deeper interpretation of the text. Language features. Question to ask: how are language features used in the text to convey meaning? For example, the use of this low angle shot of Loki in the Avengers makes Loki look powerful and therefore affects the way in which I make meaning of him. Stylistic choices and features. Question to ask: how are stylistic features used in the text to convey meaning? Example, the repetition of the phrase on your left between Captain America and Falcon in Captain America the Winter Soldier and Avengers Endgame influenced the way in which I made meaning of their relationship. Structural features. Question to ask: how are structural features used in the text to convey meaning? An example is the withholding of the plot twist in the movie Fight Club, and withholding that completely altered the way in which I made meaning of that text. Next, we have themes, ideas, issues, and concepts. This is the subject of the next lesson. We'll have a little discussion of it now. Question to ask: how are those themes, ideas, issues, and concepts conveyed? Next question: how do they affect the meaning you make of the text? For example, how does the theme of environmentalism in WALL-E impact the way you make meaning of the text? Last but not least, we have inclusions, omissions, emphases, and marginalizations in the text. We'll have a brief discussion of each one, starting with inclusions. Question to ask: what is the effect of the text including something? Example, the Marvel movie The Eternals included the most diverse cast ever in a Marvel movie at that time. What was the effect of that inclusion of a diverse cast on the way in which you made meaning of the text? Omissions. Question to ask: what is the effect of the text omitting or leaving out something? I've left a link to a deleted scene from the movie The Batman with Robert Pattinson, which came out in 2022. Go and give that a watch and then come back once you're done. So we get an appearance from the Joker in that deleted scene. If you've seen The Batman, you'll know that the Joker doesn't actually appear in the movie. So here we're really asking, what is the effect of leaving the Joker out of the movie, The Batman? They obviously considered including him because they wouldn't have shot the scene otherwise, but they ultimately decided to leave it out. They ultimately decided to omit it. I personally think the effect of omitting that scene was to keep the plot airtight. I think including the Joker in the story would have detracted from the plot. There was already quite a bit going on. Batman had his own internal conflicts. He also had an external conflict with the villain, the Riddler. And I think having the Joker in there as well would have involved juggling too many balls. Next one, emphases. Relevant question: what is the effect of the text emphasizing something? Our example for this one is a scene from the movie Schindler's List. The scene is linked in the resources tab below the video. Go check it out and come back once you're done. In that scene, you would have seen that the movie is black and white. It's all black and white except for the coat of a girl. As we can see, the coat is red. How does the emphasis on this color red in the otherwise black and white movie that is Schindler's List influence the process of making meaning of that text? Finally, marginalizations. Question to ask: what is the effect of the text marginalizing something or pushing it to the side? One example of this could be Margot Robbie's brief appearances in Quentin Tarantino's movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Some people complained that Margot Robbie only had a little bit of screen time, and that was somehow a reflection of Tarantino's gender bias. There were a lot of articles that discussed this. I've left a link to one of those articles in the resources tab. You can go and give it a read if you want to, but it's not compulsory. Either way, how does Robbie's brief appearances in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood impact the way you make meaning of that film? Those are our 9 concepts that influence our reading of a text. Now I'd like you to think about reading, which is the process of making meaning of a text, as though it is a lens through which you view a text. Here is our analogy that we're going to use to understand this point better. This is Kevin. This is the real life Kevin. And this is Alyssa. These are Alyssa's sepia lenses. This is Ben, and these are Ben's black and white lenses. Finally, this is Kate, and these are Kate's kaleidoscope lenses. The main point here is that each lens equals a different process of making meaning. Each person views Kevin through a different lens, and as a result, they have a different meaning of Kevin. As we just learnt, each person's process of making meaning is influenced by those 9 concepts that we just discussed. As context is the main factor that influences someone's reading of a text, let's see how the respective personal contexts of Alyssa, Ben, and Kate influences the way in which they make meaning of Kevin. Importantly, as we're going through this discussion, pretend that each person's context represents the type of lens they're wearing. Turning to Alyssa and her sepia lenses first, she adores dogs. She's always wanted one as a kid, but her parents never let her get one. Alyssa has just moved out of home and she's thinking of buying a dog. Those contextual factors represent Alyssa's sepia lenses. Those contextual factors are the lens through which she views Kevin, the text. Turning to Ben, Ben is an overworked veterinarian who is sick of his job and wants a career change. Those contextual factors represent the lens through which Ben views Kevin. Finally, there's Kate. Her dog, which looked just like Kevin, died yesterday. Kate's personal context represents the lens through which she views Kevin, and that explains why she's so sad. So, the main point here is that the unique dog-related experiences of Alyssa, Ben, and Kate heavily influence the process by which they made meaning of Kevin. Each dog-related experience explains why Alyssa, Ben, and Kate see Kevin differently. Their respective experiences informed the way in which they made meaning of him. We'll return to this analogy in just a moment. Now let's briefly touch on this idea of reading practices. Another way to think of this term is just simply readings, as in the plural of reading. We know that reading refers to the process of making meaning of a text. Reading practices or readings refers to the fact that there are general categories that guide the process of making meaning of a text. The glossary outlines 3 categories of readings. Starting at the top, readings are particular interpretations of a text. The classification of readings into alternative, resistant, or dominant is quite arbitrary, depending on the ideology held by the reader. Alternative readings are readings that focus on the gaps and silences in text to create meanings that vary from those meanings that seem to be foregrounded by the text. A dominant reading is the reading that seems to be, for the majority of people in society, the natural or normal way to interpret a text. In a society where there are strongly competing discourses, i.e. most societies, the definition of what is a dominant reading depends on the ideology of the person making the decision. Finally, a resistant reading is a way of reading or making meaning from a text which challenges or questions the assumptions underlying the text. Resistant readings employ a discourse different from the discourse that produces the dominant reading. In light of that, our definition for reading practices is the process of making meaning of a text through pre-established parameters. You can think of those reading practices, dominant, resistant, alternative, as lenses that set parameters or guidelines for how you should view or read a given text. Let's elaborate on what each of those 3 reading practices involves, starting with a dominant reading, and we're just going to go with the following definition of a dominant reading. It is an expected or common interpretation of a text. This lens encourages you to think about the most popular or likely interpretation of a text and how that interpretation might be arrived at. Example, Alyssa would have a dominant reading of Kevin because she's always wanted a dog and Kevin reminds her of that. Kevin looks happy, cuddly, and approachable. That is a dominant reading because most people would look at Kevin and think those things about him. On to resistant reading. A resistant reading is just an interpretation of a text that's contrary to the dominant reading. This lens encourages you to think about an interpretation that is essentially just the opposite of a dominant reading and how that interpretation might be arrived at. Ben would have a resistant reading of Kevin because he's sick of his job and doesn't want to work with animals anymore. He doesn't want a bar of Kevin looking happy and cute and is resistant to that dominant perception of him. Finally, an alternative reading. Definition, an interpretation of a text that is unique or different. This lens encourages you to think about a different interpretation of a text and how that interpretation might be arrived at. Kate would have an alternative reading of Kevin because her recent experience of her dog dying made her feel sad when she saw Kevin, despite there being nothing about Kevin, objectively speaking, to make someone feel sad. Kate's personal context gave her a unique process of making meaning of Kevin. So that is reading and readings. Now let's talk about interpretation, starting with our definition, and this is what the Scarza glossary has to say about it. See reading and readings. Clearly, that definition doesn't help us too much, so we're going to use this one instead. Our interpretation is the reading of the text and the meaning made as a result. So interpretation is a 2-step process that encompasses this concept of reading and then involves one extra step. Interpretation involves, firstly, reading, which is the process of making meaning of the text, and secondly, the meaning itself. That is why I emphasize the word process in our definition of reading. Now let's discuss the interplay between your reading and interpretation of a text. The key takeaway to start us off, reading is the process that allows you to arrive at an interpretation of a text. In other words, reading a text is a prerequisite to interpreting it. Here's a scenario. Let's say Amanda asks for my interpretation of the 2009 movie Avatar. The link to the trailer is in the resources tab below the video. If you haven't seen it or if it's not very fresh in your mind, go and give it a watch. Assuming I haven't seen the movie, my response to Amanda's question would be something like this. I don't know, I haven't seen it. Bingo. Watching the movie is the process of making meaning of it. Watching the movie is reading it. In other words, because I haven't read Avatar, because I haven't gone through that process of watching it, making meaning of it, I can't give Amanda my meaning of it. I can't give Amanda my interpretation of it. Hence, reading a text is a prerequisite to interpreting it. Now let's assume a few days later, I watch Avatar and send Amanda the following message. Hey Amanda, thanks for the suggestion. I loved Avatar. This was my interpretation of it. Humanity has lost touch with Mother Earth and the symbiosis it once had with her. This is the sort of language you use to text your mates, right? Point being is that I was only able to arrive at that interpretation because of my reading of the movie. I could only tell Amanda what meaning I had made of the movie because I had watched it. So we saw my interpretation of Avatar. The next question that arises is, what influenced that interpretation? The answer to this question is the 9 concepts that we discussed earlier that influence our reading of a text. As we know, the most important concept is context, so we'll focus on that one. Just bear in mind that those other factors exist and can influence the process and the actual meaning that we make of a text. Let's talk about the context of reception. Let's say I had that conversation with Amanda in 2022. Here are some general features that are relevant to the cultural context of reception in 2022. We've got the coronavirus pandemic, which is a socio-cultural feature. Pandemic forced people into lockdown, couldn't leave their houses, limited interactions with nature. We have climate change, which is a socio-cultural and ideological feature. Human activities of burning fossil fuels produce heat-trapping gases, which cause long-term shifts in weather patterns and temperatures around the world. Ultimately, this has the effect of disrupting the usual balance of nature. Those are some general features. Here are some more specific features. This is really referring to my situation as I was watching this movie in 2022. Some relevant personal factors. I'm in my mid-20s. I'm a white male, middle class. I have a private school education and university degrees. In other words, all of that reeks of privilege. I'm aware of climate change. I'm fascinated by the way technological advancement impacts society. And I've observed that such advancements seem to be correlated with spending less time outdoors. Think about how much more time we would all be spending outdoors if streaming services and social media platforms didn't exist. So those are some factors that were sitting in my subconscious as I read Avatar, as I watched it. Ultimately, those factors influenced the meaning I made of it, my interpretation of the movie. That's scenario one. Our next scenario illustrates the following point. Interpretations vary because everyone has their own nuance and individual reading of a text. Those three reading practices, alternative, dominant, and resistant, are just a simple way of categorizing the infinite various interpretations of a given text. With that in mind, now let's assume that Amanda asks Rosalie, a First Nations woman, for her interpretation of Avatar. Rosalie tells Amanda that her interpretation of Avatar is that it is an allegory of humanity's tendency to forcibly relocate a small group of people to satisfy the demands of a large one. Let's focus on the influence of context on Rosalie's interpretation. Same context of reception, 2022. Let's talk about the context of culture. We have the European colonization of Australia, which is a historical feature. We have the invasion of land inhabited by First Nations people, which is a historical feature. More recently, there's Rio Tinto's destruction of a 46,000-year-old cave as part of an iron ore exploration project in 2020, and the subsequent impact on the Hutu, Kunti, Kurama, and Pinakura people, who are the traditional owners of the land where the cave is based. And that is a geographic, socio-cultural, and ideological feature. By the way, I'm sure I butchered the pronunciation earlier. I apologize. Those are some general features. Let's talk about some situational features, some specific features. Rosalie is also in her mid-20s and she is a First Nations woman. Her family, her ancestors were oppressed, marginalized, and discriminated against, and forced to assimilate into an alien culture. I just want to note that I don't purport to be an expert on First Nations people's history, and I acknowledge my ignorance on the subject matter considering my own privileged upbringing. The main point from scenario 2 is that there is no right or wrong interpretation of a text. Further to that, you can say your interpretation of a text is practically anything, provided you substantiate it by referring to any of the 9 concepts. This is a good thing because in an assessment context, you can get away with saying that your interpretation of a text is anything. We have discussed reading, we've discussed interpretation, now let's discuss response. Here's our definition. A feeling or emotion experienced by a person as a result of their interpretation of a text. An important part of this definition is the words "as a result." Remember, we've mentioned throughout this lesson that our reading determines our interpretation, and our interpretation determines our response. That relationship between interpretation and response is reflected here. Our meaning that we make of a text will influence the way we respond to it. Let's look at some words that you can use to describe your response to a text. No surprises here. When it comes to addressing this concept of a response in an exam question, you should use adjectives to articulate your response. Using an adjective or adjectives to articulate your response is really important because it allows the marker to clearly identify that you are addressing the response part of the question. Here is a great chart you can use to help you describe your response to a text. It's in the PDF study notes. Pause the video now, have a quick little skim of it, and come back once you're done. Next main section of the lesson, the interplay between your reading of, interpretation of, and response to a text. We've skirted around this topic a lot over this lesson. Let's just address it directly. Your reading determines your interpretation determines your response. Let's elaborate this a little bit. If you think about this logically, it makes sense. You can't make meaning of something you haven't read, and you can't have a response to something if you can't make meaning of it. Let's return to the avatar example. My reading of that text was influenced by the contextual factors that we discussed earlier, as well as, to a lesser extent, those other 8 concepts. That reading of the text then led to my interpretation of it, which is that humanity has lost touch with Mother Earth and the symbiosis it once had with her. Because of that interpretation, my response to the text could be described as saddened, disappointed, worried, etc. Note, just because these words, saddened, disappointed, worried, could describe my response to the text, that doesn't mean they could describe everyone else's response to the text. Again, this is because our unique interpretations of texts generate our own unique responses to them. Here's a table that succinctly summarizes the interplay between the concepts that we've discussed so far. Our reading is the process of making meaning of a text. For example, for context of reception, we discussed my context of reception in watching the movie Avatar in 2022. For the cultural context, we discussed COVID and climate change. For situational context, we discussed that I'm a privileged white male and that I'm fascinated by the impact of technology on society. This stuff then determines my interpretation, which is the meaning made of a text as a result of reading it. My interpretation of Avatar was that humanity has lost touch with Mother Earth and the symbiosis it once had with her. All of this stuff, the interpretation, then leads to my response, which is a feeling or emotion experienced by a person as a result of their interpretation of a text. My response to Avatar as a result of my interpretation was saddened, disappointed, worried, etc. And remember that we're using that chart with the adjectives in it. This table here is really your cheat sheet for the 3 concepts we've discussed. I think it really summarizes the essence of what you need to know. And you would have seen it's in the PDF study notes. Before we look at a past WACE exam question, I want to discuss the significance of the words you and your in analytical exam questions. I was going to make this the subject of its own separate lesson, but then as I was looking at the questions that the words you and your appear in, they're almost always associated with the concepts of reading, interpretation, and response. This is illustrated in the following text box, which is in the PDF study notes as well. Pause the video and have a quick scan of these questions and this little note below, and come back once you're done. Hopefully you can see that these words you and your are very relevant in light of how many times they appear in exam questions. You're probably thinking, Lennox, what's the big deal here? They're just the words you and your. They don't really have much significance. They do. And this is summarized in the following key takeaway. Whenever the words you and your appear in an analytical question from the comprehending section or responding section, you are invited to write in the first person. If you can take away one thing from this entire lesson, it is this key takeaway, because this is really very easy to understand, but it is so easily overlooked under the timed condition of an exam. In that key takeaway, I said that you are invited to write in the first person. What exactly does that mean? It means that you're encouraged to use pronouns like I, me, and my, and write with a personal voice. This last point, write with a personal voice, just means write with personality, write with flair. Let your own personality shine through in the words you use. Here's an analogy that I like to use to explain this point further. The inclusion or omission of the words you and your in an exam context is like the difference between being invited to a party and not being invited. If you're invited, it's acceptable and expected that you'll attend. In other words, if the question has the word you or your in it, it means that you're expected to write in the first person. If you're invited but don't go to the party, it looks like you're just ignoring the person who invited you. The same is true of analytical exam questions. If a question includes the word you or your and don't write in the first person, you've missed a pretty important part of the question. And when you miss an important part of the question, you miss out on some pretty easy marks. On the other hand, if you're not invited, it's acceptable and expected that you won't attend. Put differently, if the question doesn't have the word you or your in it, it means that you should not write in the first person. If you're not invited to the party, but you go anyway, it's a bit weird, and then you're that guy who rocked up to the party when you weren't invited. There's no rule saying you can't, but you just wouldn't do it. The same is true regarding analytical exam questions. If they don't include the word you or your, but then you write in the first person anyway, it's a bit weird. Everything we've just discussed relates to analytical questions, questions from the comprehending section and responding section. Why doesn't this rule apply to creative questions, questions in the composing section? In short, these questions don't always require you to write in the first person. For instance, this question, compose a text in a genre of your choice that explores an idea suggested by the image. The word your in this question simply requires you to choose whether you will write a persuasive, imaginative, or interpretive text. You could validly answer this question by writing an imaginative text using third-person limited narrative POV, which, as we know, doesn't involve using those pronouns like I, me, and my. Before we wrap up, let's take a quick look at a past WACE exam question that illustrates how you can incorporate a discussion of some of the concepts we've discussed. Our question is, discuss how you developed a more considered interpretation of a text by reflecting on at least one different reading of it. 2019 WACE exam, section 2, question 8. Firstly, let's identify the main parts of the question. First thing we should take note of is the invitation to write in the first person because the question states, discuss how you. Another main part of this question is this term, a more considered interpretation. This doesn't just mean any interpretation. Remember, Skaza spends quite a bit of time writing these questions, thinking about how to word them. So every single word in the question is there for a reason. So because this question states a more considered interpretation, we need to make it clear in our response that our interpretation is in fact more considered. More considered just means refined or thought over. The last significant part of this question is one different reading. We know that reading refers to the process of making meaning of a text, and it's influenced by several concepts, namely context. All of those concepts or factors work together to create a unique lens through which a person reads a text. All in all, this question asks you to discuss how looking at a text through a different lens has led you to develop a more refined interpretation of it. Here is an excerpt of a response that answers each part of the question that we just dissected. As a white male in his mid-20s, my initial interpretation of the feature film Avatar was that humanity has lost touch with Mother Earth and the symbiosis it once had with her. However, upon reflection on a different reading of the text, I have developed a more considered interpretation. Avatar is a fantastical reminder of humanity's unrelenting obsession with power and how it is willing to alienate people in order to obtain it. This refined interpretation of the text was inspired by a conversation with my friend Rosalie, a First Nations woman whose personal context had a profound impact on her reading of the text. Let's briefly discuss how that excerpt addresses those main parts of the question, starting with this first main part, the word you. I addressed this part of the question quite simply by writing in the first person, by using words like my and I. Now onto this part of the question. I explained what my initial interpretation of the text was as a means to highlight how my more considered interpretation is in fact more considered. Notice how I'm also using the terminology that the question uses. This is such an easy hack to tell the marker that you are addressing the main parts of the question. Even if you don't execute it that well, the pure and simple fact that you're using the same terminology is one of the first things the marker is looking for. Lastly, this part of the question, I explained that my more considered interpretation was developed as a result of my conversation with Rosalie and her different reading of the text. Once again, note the use of the terminology from the question in my actual response. We done. Simple summary time. Firstly, we looked at reading, and our definition of reading is the process of making meaning of a text. Then we learned that reading does not just equal the act of reading a book. The term applies to any text that you study in English ATAR. Then we looked at the concepts that influence your reading of a text. Context is the main concept, the main factor. The other concepts are perspectives, values and attitudes, genre expectations, language features, stylistic choices and features, structural features, themes, ideas, issues, and concepts explored in the text, and inclusions, omissions, emphases, and marginalizations in the text. Then we looked at your reading of a text equals the lens through which you view it. And we said that while looking at Kevin the dog, Alyssa wears sepia glasses, Ben wears black and white glasses, and Kate wears kaleidoscope glasses. Alyssa, she loves dogs, Ben hates dogs, and Kate has a dead dog. Each person will experience a different process of making meaning of Kevin because they looked at him through a different lens. Then we looked at reading practices, aka readings. Our definition, the process of making meaning of a text through pre-established parameters or boundaries. And we have 3 main readings. The dominant reading is an expected or common interpretation of a text. Think of Alyssa's sepia lenses. She loves dogs. That would be the dominant reading of Kevin. A resistant reading is an interpretation of a text contrary to the dominant reading. Think about Ben's black and white lenses. He hates dogs. That would be a resistant reading towards Kevin. And then an alternative reading is an interpretation of a text that is unique or different. And think of Kate's kaleidoscope lenses. Her interpretation is that Kate is reminded of her dead dog when she sees Kevin. We then moved on to a discussion of interpretation. Our definition of interpretation is the reading of the text and the meaning made as a result. Next section of this part of the lesson was the interplay between your reading and interpretation of a text. We saw that reading is the process that allows you to arrive at an interpretation of a text. For example, I need to read Avatar before I can provide an interpretation of it. A key takeaway for this part of the lesson was that there is no right or wrong interpretation of a text. It is a very personal thing. Then we looked at response. Our definition of response is a feeling or emotion experienced by a person as a result of their interpretation of a text. We then looked at words to describe your response to a text. The key takeaway here was that you should use adjectives to articulate your response to a text. And you should use that chart that we looked at to find adjectives to use to express your response. Then we discussed the interplay between your reading of, interpretation of, and response to a text. In short, that interplay is summarized as follows. Your reading influences, determines your interpretation, and your interpretation determines your response. Then we looked at the significance of the words you and your in analytical exam questions. Key takeaway. Whenever the words you and your appear in those questions, you are invited to write in the first person. Analogy, the inclusion or omission of the words you or your in analytical exam questions is like the difference between being invited to a party and not being invited to a party. If you're invited, it's acceptable and it's expected that you'll attend. If you're not invited, it's expected and it's acceptable that you will not attend. Last main section of the lesson was a past WACE exam question. Here, I emphasize that you should always heed or take note of the nuances in the terminology of the question. For example, a more considered interpretation means a more refined or more thought over interpretation. All right, that is everything I wanted to say about reading, interpretation, and response. If you want to consolidate this understanding of those concepts, make sure you complete the related text table. It's only in relation to one text. There's only one table. Be nice and easy. Get it done. Move on. Thanks for your attention in this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Until then, keep it simple.